Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer where we are going to explore the absolutely fascinating, vast landscape of the human mind. From the very moment we're born, we're just bombarded with information we don't quite understand. But as we grow, we learn the rules. We are, at our very core, meaning-making machines. We're constantly observing, processing, and trying our hardest to understand the inner workings of the mind, both our own and the minds of everyone around us. To make sense of all this today, we're going to follow a roadmap with 4 distinct stops: the spectrum of emotion, cognition and memory, the architecture of change, and finally, social dynamics and groups. Let's get to it. So, let me ask you something. Why do we constantly try to explain the behaviors of total strangers? Have you ever seen someone sprinting down the street and immediately assumed, oh, they must be running from the cops? Or maybe a coworker is acting a little quiet and you instantly think they're hiding some huge secret. Well, this process is actually called attribution. We are so inherently fascinated by why people do what they do that our brains automatically try to assign meaning to literally every situation, constantly scanning for internal or external factors to just explain the world.
Section 1, the spectrum of emotion. We're looking at feelings that go way beyond English.
Now, feelings are hard enough to express with the words we already have, right? But sometimes the English language really struggles to capture those nuanced, obscure emotional states. Take the word hygge, for example. It's a Scandinavian term that doesn't really have a direct English translation. It basically encapsulates a mood of extreme coziness, charm, and warmth. It's that hyper-specific, comforting feeling you get when you're wrapped up in a cozy blanket with a hot cup of cocoa on a rainy day. But then, in stark contrast to that cozy feeling, we have saudade. This is a Portuguese word that beautifully but tragically captures a really deep sense of permanent loss. It describes this intense, nostalgic longing for a person or a place that's far away, specifically when you know deep down that you will likely never see that person or place ever again. And then there's Schadenfreude. This is a German term that's actually made its way into American pop culture quite a bit. It literally means feeling pleasure in someone else's pain. Imagine you see a cute puppy run away from someone you just really, really dislike, and that person gets super upset. That tiny little sense of joy you feel at their disappointment? Yep, that is Schadenfreude in action. But what happens when we feel a super intense physical sensation and we don't have any word for it? Like, is it fear or is it love? When we struggle to name an emotion, our brain desperately looks for environmental cues to help us label what we're experiencing physically. And this leads us to a fascinating psychological concept known as the two-factor theory of emotion. So the two-factor theory suggests that emotion isn't just a physical sensation in your body, and it isn't just a thought in your head. It's actually a combination of physiological arousal and cognitive appraisal. For instance, if your heart is racing and your palms are sweating, your brain frantically looks around. If a terrifying clown is chasing you, you appraise that as a threat and immediately label it fear. But if that clown suddenly calls out your name and you realize it's just your best friend pulling a prank, you reappraise it and label it relief. This exact mechanism can cause the misattribution of arousal. It's exactly why walking across a terrifying, swaying suspension bridge with a date can make you mistakenly attribute your racing heart to romantic attraction, rather than just the sheer terror of heights. Section 2, Cognition and Memory. Think of this as the mind's filing cabinet. Okay, so how exactly do we store all this meaning and these complex emotional labels? Well, to understand how we manage the massive amount of data in our world, we have to look at schema theory. Think of your mind as a giant filing cabinet. A schema is a mental framework. It's like an individual index card in that cabinet. It helps us quickly organize and interpret new information without having to start from scratch every single time we see a dog or walk into a restaurant. But the crucial point here is that while these schemas save a ton of mental energy, they can also produce really inaccurate judgments and stereotypes. Like if your internal schema for a doctor is exclusively male, you might completely struggle to solve a riddle where a doctor operates on a boy and actually turns out to be his mother. And the crazy thing is, our ability to process all these mental index cards is severely limited by our working memory. Cognitive load theory explains that we can literally only handle a few pieces of information at once before we just short circuit. Your brain is constantly juggling the intrinsic load, which is how inherently hard the task is, the extrinsic load, which is how the info is being presented to you, and the germane load, which is the actual heavy lifting your brain does to create a permanent schema. If you overload these three, you just forget things, which is exactly why multitasking is, scientifically speaking, a total myth. Your working memory just cannot handle it.
To truly appreciate how memory works, we kind of have to look at what happens when it breaks down. Consider the really tragic case of Clive Wearing. He was a British musician who contracted a virus that absolutely ravaged his hippocampus, resulting in the most severe case of amnesia ever recorded. He suffered from both anterograde amnesia, meaning he could literally no longer make new memories, and retrograde amnesia, meaning he lost all his past memories. Clive's working memory span was reduced to just 7 to 30 seconds. Every half minute, his consciousness essentially just rebooted. Yet, here's the truly wild part. Despite lacking episodic memories of his own life, Clive could still read music, play incredibly complex piano pieces, and even conduct an entire choir. This brilliantly illustrates just how insanely complex the human brain is. His semantic and procedural memories, basically his muscle memory, were stored in a completely different part of the brain, the cerebellum, which thankfully remained completely intact.
Section 3. The architecture of change. How do we go about reprogramming the self? So if our brains are so deeply structured with all these ingrained schemas and complex memory pathways, how do we ever deliberately change who we are? Well, psychologists use the Transtheoretical Model of Change to show that shifting our identity, or even just breaking a bad habit, is a long journey, not an overnight switch. There are 6 stages here. You start in pre-contemplation, where you don't even think there's a problem at all. Then you move to contemplation, preparation, and finally action. But you can't stop there. Action has to be followed by maintenance for at least 6 months. And realistically, relapse is listed right here as a totally normal part of the whole shebang, where you just identify your triggers and simply start again. When we look at organizations or even deep personal identity, Kurt Lewin's change theory uses this brilliant metaphor of a block of ice. If you want a new shape, you can't just smash the ice, right? Step 1, you have to unfreeze or melt down the old structure. Step 2, you change by moving into a new behavior. And step 3, you refreeze to cement those new practices into your actual culture or life. On a personal level, major life catalysts like trauma, drugs, time, or a massive commitment like a marriage or a religious baptism can act as that unfreezing mechanism. And while a lot of folks believe personality is just fixed from birth, adopting a growth mindset actually allows for this kind of profound adaptation and a total shift in our core identity. Now, let's see how all this builds into an absolutely amazing psychological hack. Self-perception theory. The common belief we all share is that our inner attitudes dictate our outer behaviors. But self-perception theory proves it actually works the other way around. Your behaviors can dictate your attitudes, seriously. If you simply force a fake smile for long enough, your mood will eventually improve because your brain literally observes your physical behavior to determine what its attitude should be. How crazy is that? Finally, Section 4, Social Dynamics and Group Influence. Let's zoom all the way out. All right, so we've looked at our inner emotions, our memory filing cabinets, and how we reprogram our personal habits. But who do we become when we join groups out there in society? Well, this is perfectly explained by social identity theory. As social animals, a huge chunk of our identity comes from where we belong. We go through 3 distinct steps. Step 1 is categorization. We look around and recognize that different groups exist in the world. Step 2 is identification. We choose the group where we feel we belong, finding our in-group. And step 3 is comparison. Our internal meaning-making inevitably creates an us versus them divide, where we view our group as fundamentally superior to others when it comes to resources and belonging. This primitive instinct is literally the root of so much conflict throughout human history. Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought to wrap things up. We started this whole thing by calling humans meaning-making machines. But if your reality is really just a constantly shifting mix of physiological arousal, mental filing cabinets, and instinctual group biases, who are you really? I hope this explainer has given you a powerful new lens to understand the landscape of your own mind and leaves you eager to learn even more about the deep psychology behind why we do the things we do. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.